The day began like any other in Berlin. Snow clung to the streets, grey lights spilling across the city, muffling the sounds of a nation at war. Yet inside a quiet, wood-panelled office, time itself seemed to stop. A single sheet of paper sat on the desk, untouched by the chaos beyond the walls. On it was a message that could unravel everything the Reich had built. For those who read it, there was no escape. The numbers on that page spelled doom. Not a distant possibility, not a warning whispered in fear, but a certainty that the war was slipping beyond Germany's grasp. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris held the report in his hands. Eyes tracing the columns and figures, he had seen impossible things before, enemies moving faster than predicted, allies betraying promises, cities burning under aerial bombardment. But this was a reckoning of a different kind. It was not a weapon forged in secrecy. It was not a new tactic on a battlefield. It was a factory, half a world away, quietly producing death, in a rhythm that Germany could never hope to match. At first the officers around him laughed. They were men of rank and privilege, trained to trust pride over reality. An American factory producing a bomber every hour. Preposterous, one sneered. Yet Canaris did not flinch. His mind worked through the implications with cold precision. 1 plane an hour, 24 planes a day, hundreds a month. And each bomber, a B-24 Liberator, was a marvel of engineering, weighing 18 tons, composed of over 1 million individual parts. For Germany, producing even a fraction of that number was impossible. The intelligence had arrived slowly, like a tide creeping over sand. Reports from neutral countries, intercepted messages, and eyewitness accounts all painted the same picture. A massive industrial complex in Michigan Willow Run was turning raw materials into weapons of war at a pace the German command refused to imagine. Businessmen returning from America spoke of assembly lines so vast they had their own microclimate. Engineers sent cryptic messages hinting at tools and machines that made aircraft in hours instead of months. Alone, each story could be dismissed. Together, they formed a truth so terrifying it could not be ignored. Canaris knew what this meant. Germany was fighting a war it could not win. Not because its soldiers were weak or its generals unskilled, but because it was being buried under the weight of American industry. The battle was no longer fought solely in trenches or skies. It was a war of factories, of assembly lines and rivet guns, of ordinary people producing extraordinary machines at a speed the Reich could never achieve. The heart of the German command, however, remained blind. Hitler, ensconced in his wolf's lair, surrounded by sycophants, refused to see beyond ideology. To him, the world was a chessboard, and the pieces moved only according to will and obedience. Reports that contradicted his vision were dismissed, hidden, or ridiculed. And above all, the Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring claimed invincibility in the air. To admit a single American plant could outproduce Germany was not just an insult, it was unthinkable. Inside the Abwehr, Canaris's network of agents and analysts worked tirelessly. They risked capture, torture, death, all for a truth no one above them wanted to hear. Every coded telegram, every intercepted conversation added weight to the inevitable conclusion: the Third Reich was on borrowed time. Canaris's loyalty was to Germany, not to the fantasies of its leaders. Yet he knew that presenting this reality was dangerous. The higher the truth climbed, the greater the risk it would be crushed by pride and denial. Half a world away, the Willow Run factory roared to life. Its walls stretched over half a mile, the largest under one roof in human history. Inside, thousands of workers, women, immigrants, and men moved with a precision that seemed impossible. One person drilled, another riveted, yet each action contributed to a machine of war rolling off the line every hour. The Nazis had mocked America as chaotic, racially mixed and disorganized. Here in Michigan, diversity had become power, and organization had become unstoppable force. The factory was more than a building. It was a symbol, Every B-24 produced chipped away at the myth of German superiority. The master race that Hitler boasted about was about to be tested against ordinary men and women united in purpose. And while the Nazis relied on ideology, propaganda, and terror, America relied on unity, ingenuity, and sheer industrial might. By March 1943, that truth had arrived in Berlin in the form of a single deadly report. Canaris tried to warn his superiors. He laid out the numbers with clarity, calculating production rates, comparing them with German outputs, and showing the inevitable conclusion: the Reich could not compete. He described the efficiency, the assembly line innovations, the relentless pace of American industry, yet Göring laughed. "The Americans make refrigerators and razors," he scoffed. "They cannot build airplanes." The arrogance was complete, the denial total. Canaris had delivered certainty, and it had been dismissed as fantasy. Even Hitler, when confronted with the facts, could not reconcile them with his worldview. To him, war was a matter of will, courage, and destiny. The idea that factories, not soldiers, might decide the outcome was an affront to his ideology. Any subordinate brave enough to insist on the reality of Willow Run risked more than ridicule. They risked their lives. Canaris understood this. He understood that the truth alone was not enough. To survive, he had to navigate a court of fear and delusion, where facts were filtered through prejudice and logic was a dangerous weapon. And yet, despite the danger, he continued. Each report from American industrial centers, each intercepted telegram, each coded message reinforced the same terrifying fact: Germany was falling behind. The war of attrition had shifted. Now, the skies were not just battlefields, they were proofs of industrial might. Every B-24 crossing the Atlantic was a reminder that the enemy had a rhythm Germany could never match. Every Allied bombing raid that tore through factories, railways, and fuel depots validated the grim mathematics Canaris had predicted months before. The stakes were not abstract. For the soldiers on the front, it meant more American bombers overhead, more supplies reaching the enemy, and more pressure on their exhausted lines. For civilians, it meant cities once considered safe were vulnerable to relentless air raids, and for the Nazi leadership, it meant a confrontation with reality they were not prepared to face. In this collision between arithmetic and ideology, ideology won, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Canaris's warning was not just strategic, it was human. He saw lives at risk, soldiers sacrificed unnecessarily, and civilians caught in the storm of a war that could have been mitigated. He understood that recognition of Willow Run's power might have altered the Reich's decisions, distributing resources differently, prioritizing defense over vanity projects, and preparing for a new kind of war. But the message was ignored, buried under ego and dogma. The most important intelligence of the war was reduced to a footnote, its significance invisible to those in power. Outside, the world continued, oblivious to the quiet reckoning in Berlin. Across oceans and continents, industrial engines roared, assembly lines hummed, and ordinary people became the invisible army shaping history. The contrast could not have been starker. One nation blinded by ideology, another empowered by cooperation and purpose. And in that contrast, the fate of millions was already being decided. March 17, 1943 was not a battlefield. There were no shells, no gunfire, no cries of wounded soldiers, yet it was a day of war unlike any other a day, when spies and analysts faced the truth in cold, undeniable numbers, and the men at the top refused to see it. The paper on Canaris's desk contained the blueprint for Germany's downfall, yet pride and ideology made it invisible. The war was no longer a matter of courage or genius, it was arithmetic, and arithmetic does not bend to desire. In the quiet office, Canaris understood something that no one above him dared admit: Germany could not match the enemy. The factories, the workers, the relentless production, they would win where the Wehrmacht could not. The report was more than intelligence. It was a death sentence, written in steel, aluminum, and time. and as the admiral looked at it, he knew the war's outcome had already been decided, not by spies, not by generals, but by the quiet, unstoppable machinery of an industrial giant half a world away. The men of the Reich laughed. They did not believe it. They could not believe it, and in that disbelief lay their undoing. History would judge that moment not for heroics on the battlefield, but for the arrogance, the blindness, and the failure to confront reality. One piece of paper, one truth, ignored. And from that day, the clock began ticking, not for victory, but for the inevitable reckoning. Half a world away, the ground at Willow Run shivered with the sound of industry. Trucks rumbled in with steel and aluminum, and cranes lifted tons of material with precision that seemed almost unnatural. Inside, the largest single-room factory in human history stretched farther than the eye could see. Over half a mile of steel, glass, and human determination. Here the war was being won not on a battlefield, but on a floor polished with sweat, ingenuity, and relentless focus. The machines never rested. Workers moved in a choreographed rhythm, each knowing their place, each performing one task over and over until it became second nature. One person drilled holes in the wing spars, another riveted panels onto the fuselage, and yet another inspected bolts with meticulous care. It was repetition, yes, but it was repetition with purpose. Every action, every motion, fed into a machine that transformed ordinary humans into a force capable of changing the course of the war. And the people were extraordinary not because of titles or rank, but because of their determination. Winnin, who a few years before would never have dreamed of operating a rivet gun, now filled the factory with energy and skill. Their movements were precise, their focus unwavering. Immigrants, African Americans, and men returning from other jobs joined together in a harmony the Nazis could not comprehend. Diversity here was not a weakness, it was strength. It produced results faster than anyone could have imagined. The assembly line itself was a marvel. Inspired by the techniques of automobile production, engineers deconstructed a B-24 Liberator into manageable sub-assemblies. Instead of building an entire aircraft piece by piece in a single shop, workers focused on one section at a time. The wing, the fuselage, the landing gear, each became a small triumph, a component that would eventually be welded together into an unstoppable bomber. Efficiency was absolute. Training was fast, precise, and thorough, allowing thousands of new workers to join the effort every week. And yet, at first, it wasn't perfect. Mistakes happened. Rivets were misaligned, panels bent, machines jammed. Supervisors cursed under their breath, correcting errors before they could cascade into disaster. The factory earned the nickname WWII Run as the workforce learned to master the pace. But by early 1943, the system clicked. Raw materials flowed in one end and emerged as 18-ton flying behemoths at the other, one after another. Every 60 minutes, the impossible had become reality. Back in Berlin, Canaris and his team followed each update with a mixture of awe and dread. The numbers kept coming, each report more chilling than the last. Production rates, output logs, and telegrams confirmed what the spies had feared. Willow Run was real. It was happening, and the scale of it meant that Germany would never keep up. Every plane that rolled off that line meant another raid, another bombing run, another blow to the already faltering Luftwaffe. Goering still laughed. Hitler still refused to listen. And yet the reality of Willow Run was undeniable. Spies risked their lives to gather the intelligence, and Canaris now had the data in black and white. The Reich was facing an enemy it could not see on the battlefield, a factory producing death with terrifying efficiency. 1 hour, one plane. The math was brutal. Germany could not match it, they could not slow it, and every delay, every arrogance-fueled dismissal, allowed Willow Run to grow stronger. Inside the factory, there was a rhythm to life that no map or report could capture. The workers were aware of the stakes. They were building machines that would cross oceans and face bullets, flak, and fire. They knew that their labor mattered, even if they could not see the destruction their planes would bring. And yet, despite the pressure, despite the long shifts and the relentless pace, there was pride. A sense that each hand that gripped a tool, each eye that inspected a panel, was part of something larger than themselves. Admiral Canaris thought often of this. He imagined the sheer size of the plant, the dedication of the people, the speed with which one building alone could produce more bombers than the Luftwaffe could deploy in months. And he understood the terrifying consequences. This was not a theoretical calculation, it was a future unfolding in real time, and Germany had no answer. No weapon, no strategy, no secret plan could undo the power of the American assembly line. Every B-24 produced at Willow Run carried with it a silent threat, precision, endurance, and inevitability. It was a weapon forged not of ideology or blood, but of organization and collective human effort, and the contrast could not have been more stark. In Berlin, the Nazi leadership trusted arrogance over reality, ideology over mathematics. They continued to prioritize vanity projects, rockets, jets, and fanciful superweapons that would never arrive in sufficient numbers. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, simple, relentless productivity was reshaping the war. Even small details mattered. The factory floor had its own quirks, like the famous tax turn, a 90-degree rotation of partially assembled bombers to avoid paying extra local taxes. To outsiders, it might seem trivial, even comical. To Canaris, it was a sign of ingenuity, proof that Americans could solve problems quickly, adapt, and innovate at a pace Germany could not match. Every clever adjustment, every shortcut without compromise, added to the unstoppable tide building in Michigan. And yet, for the Nazis, such ingenuity was inconceivable. Their worldview demanded order, hierarchy, and racial purity. The idea that a chaotic, diverse workforce could outperform a master race relied on mathematics, not ideology. That alone made the truth unbearable. Canaris's reports were accurate, they were verifiable, but they were also intolerable. To acknowledge them would be to admit that the Nazi ideology was irrelevant in the face of human effort organized around a single goal. As the months passed, the first B-24s rolled off the assembly line and took to the skies. They crossed the Atlantic, their engines a steady, menacing hum that German pilots would hear in nightmares. The planes were armed, fast, and resilient. They arrived in Europe not as single machines, but as an endless stream, overwhelming the Luftwaffe's defenses. The raids were precise, devastating, and relentless. Factories, rail lines, fuel depots, nothing could survive the continuous assault. Every sortie proved Canaris right, every bombing validated the terrifying arithmetic of Willow Run. And yet, in Berlin, the warning remained buried. Göring refused to act. Hitler dismissed it as propaganda, a personal affront to his vision of the war. The reports of mass production, the tales of unstoppable assembly lines were filtered, minimized, or ignored. Canaris understood the danger not just to Germany, but to himself. Bringing truth to a court of paranoia and ego was like walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers. One wrong move, one insistence on facts could mean death. But Canaris could not stay silent. The intelligence had to reach those who mattered most. Even if Hitler would not listen, even if the ministers of war and air laughed at the numbers, the record needed to be made. It needed to exist, because someday, when the numbers could no longer be ignored, the truth would be undeniable, and when that day came, it would be too late to save the Reich. Back at Willow Run, the factory never stopped. Shifts overlapped, machines hummed, thousands of hands worked in unison, unaware of the names of those they were destroying, unaware of the maps that were being redrawn by their labor. Each rivet, each panel, each completed bomber was a countdown, an unseen clock ticking toward Germany's undoing. The impossible dream of one plane per hour had become reality, and the Germans had no answer. The contrast was striking. One side relied on ideology, ego, and blind confidence. The other side relied on ordinary people, working together in extraordinary ways. And it was those ordinary people, thousands of miles away, who were quietly reshaping the fate of nations. The difference between victory and defeat was no longer measured in generals, battles, or courage. It was measured in hours, in output, in relentless, unstoppable human effort. Canaris could only watch. He could calculate, warn, plead, and prepare. But he could not force the Reich to act. He knew the enemy's advantage was not just speed or technology, it was reality itself. The numbers did not lie. And in a system built on delusion, belief, and denial, truth was the deadliest weapon of all. As the first B-24s dropped bombs on German cities, the irony was complete. Germany's soldiers fought bravely, its pilots flew with courage, yet the tide had already turned. Victory had shifted from courage in combat to mastery of production, and the seeds of that victory had been planted in the quiet, humming halls of a factory in Michigan, where ordinary humans were doing the extraordinary, hour after hour, day after day. The war that Germany thought it was fighting, the war of ideology, of supremacy, of destiny, was over. The real war had begun, and it was being waged not with guns, not with tanks, but with steel, sweat, and relentless, unyielding human effort. March 17, 1943, had been the day of revelation in Berlin. The true consequences were now unfolding in real time. And for the men of the Reich, the reckoning had only just begun. The roar came first, distant and low, like a storm rolling over the horizon. Then it grew, engines screaming across the sky, filling German cities with a sound that promised destruction. The B-24 liberators were coming, and with them, the reality of Willow Run could no longer be ignored. Canaris had predicted it months earlier, yet for the Luftwaffe and the Reich's leaders, this was a nightmare they refused to see. Berlin, Hamburg, and the industrial heartlands braced themselves. Anti-aircraft guns spat fire into the clouds, tracers cutting jagged lines through the grey. Pilots of the Luftwaffe scrambled, knowing their numbers were already stretched too thin. For every fighter in the air, 10 bombers were crossing the Atlantic, each one a flying testament to the American assembly line's relentless pace. The sky was no longer just a battlefield. It was proof that the Germans had been outproduced, outplanned, and outmatched. In the offices of the High Command, panic began to ripple through the ranks. Reports flooded in, factories destroyed, railways torn apart, oil depots in flames. Each telegram confirmed what Canaris had been saying all along. Every sortie of the B-24s from Willow Run was a hammer striking of the very bones of the Reich. Yet Göring still refused to acknowledge it. Hitler's inner circle clung to the fantasy of invincibility. Numbers, facts, and reason were dismissed as exaggeration. Even treachery on the ground, German civilians ran for shelter as the first bombs fell. Smoke choked the streets. Fire consumed factories that had been the pride of a nation, and above it all, the liberators continued their unrelenting journey, a constant reminder that the war was no longer about courage alone. Survival depended on recognizing reality, and Germany had chosen denial. Pilots in the Luftwaffe fought bravely, executing daring maneuvers and risking their lives against the swarm of bombers. Yet the odds were impossible. For every plane they shot down, 10 more arrived. The numbers spoke a language the commanders refused to hear. Arithmetic, not ideology, now ruled the sky. The once feared Luftwaffe was overwhelmed, a symbol of a nation that had prioritized ego over logic. The factories destroyed were more than steel and machinery. They were the lifeblood of Germany's war effort. Each bomb shattered production schedules, delayed aircraft deliveries, and starved the front lines of fuel, weapons, and reinforcements. And all the while, the B-24s continued to roll off the lines in Michigan, their output accelerating as Germany struggled to respond. One factory, unseen and untouchable across an ocean, was changing the war more than any battle fought on German soil. Inside the Reich, Canaris watched helplessly. He had warned them. He had shown the numbers, he had risked everything to convey the truth, but pride and ideology had won over reason. The Reich's leaders were living in a fantasy, while reality unfolded above their heads in smoke, fire, and steel. Each raid was a confirmation the war was slipping beyond their control, and the empire that had once seemed unstoppable was crumbling under the weight of facts it refused to see. By late 1943, the strategy of the Allies was clear. Daylight bombing raids, once considered too risky, were now executed with devastating precision. The 8th Air Force, powered by the output of Willow Run, unleashed wave after wave of bombers. Cities that had once seemed safe were now exposed. Factories, railways, and refineries, the very infrastructure of war, were under constant assault. Germany's ability to respond had collapsed. And still, in Berlin, the myth of invincibility persisted. Leaders clung to the fantasy that technology, bravery, and ideology could overcome raw production. But the math told a different story. One bomber an hour from Willow Run meant hundreds of aircraft raining destruction every month. It was a relentless tide that Germany could not match, and every ignored warning, every dismissed report made the coming defeat inevitable. The skies were now a battlefield of truth and denial. Smoke rose, fires raged, and German pilots fought against the unstoppable tide. Meanwhile, the unseen hand of Willow Run continued its quiet, efficient work, producing the weapons that would crush the Reich's hopes. History was no longer being written in strategy rooms or council meetings. It was being forged in factories and assembly lines, far from the eyes of those who refused to see. March 17, 1943, had been the day the truth arrived in Berlin. The consequences were now unfolding in real time. Germany could not escape the reckoning. Every engine that screamed across the sky, every bomb that tore through factories, every B-24 rolling off the line in Michigan was a reminder that the war had already been decided by numbers, by industry, and by human effort united in a purpose the Reich could not comprehend. The sound of alarms filled the night skies over Germany. Sirens wailed through cities and towns as blackouts were enforced. Citizens ran for shelters, clutching children, hearts pounding, knowing the bombs were coming again. The B-24s were relentless, and there was no hiding from them. Germany was learning painfully that the war was no longer about courage alone. It was about output, speed, and unstoppable momentum. In Berlin, Canaris's office was filled with reports, telegrams, and calculations. His heart was heavy. Every page confirmed the truth he had tried to convey months ago. Factories flattened, railways destroyed, fuel depots ablaze. The Reich's war machine was faltering, not because of enemy ingenuity on the battlefield, but because of a reality no one in power would face. Willow Run existed, and its output was unmatched. Göring refused to acknowledge it. His face was a mask of arrogance, his words dripping with disbelief. "They cannot sustain this," he claimed, waving away Canaris's figures. "The Americans are weak, their people cannot organize like we do." But the truth was undeniable. The numbers were brutal. One bomber an hour, 124 a day, hundreds a month. The Reich could not keep up, not in planes, not in bombs, not in strategy. Canaris knew the danger of speaking too plainly. Hitler's inner circle thrived on flattery and loyalty, punishing those who challenged their illusions. The admiral had already skirted the edge of suspicion. Every insistence on facts was a risk. Yet he persisted. He could not remain silent while the Reich was being destroyed from above by machines and humans working with a speed and purpose Germany could never match. The Luftwaffe scrambled pilots day after day, men flying into the face of overwhelming odds. Brave as they were, the results were always the same. For every bomber shot down, 10 more replaced it. Fuel shortages, maintenance delays, and the constant strain of operations left them exhausted. Canaris watched it all with grim clarity. The war was now a battle of endurance and arithmetic, and Germany was losing. Inside the factories and council rooms of Berlin, panic was growing. Orders were shouted. Meetings ran late into the night. Ministers and generals argued over priorities, yet every plan was too little, too late. The Reich's industrial heart was bleeding, and the leaders' pride blinded them to solutions. Even when accurate intelligence landed on their desks, it was filtered through ego, ideology, and fear. Facts became inconvenient, truth became dangerous. Canaris also knew the personal cost of persistence. His network of agents was under scrutiny. The Gestapo had eyes everywhere searching for signs of dissent. His association with the resistance, the theologians, and those quietly opposing Hitler's madness had put him in danger. Yet Canaris continued. He was a man of principle, loyal to Germany, not to the delusions of its rulers. The truth was his weapon, and he wielded it carefully, aware that one misstep could mean death. Meanwhile, across Europe, the American bombing campaigns continued without pause. B-24s rained destruction on industrial centers, rail yards, and oil refineries. Cities once untouched were now scarred. Fires turned nights into daylight. The Luftwaffe fought, but they were overwhelmed. Every raid, every bomber produced by WWII reminded Germany of the reality they refused to accept. The war was no longer about bravery alone. It was about production, speed, and relentless persistence. Hitler's denial deepened with every report. Numbers that contradicted his worldview were seen not as facts, but as attacks on his vision, personal insults to his ideology. To acknowledge WWII would be to admit that Germany had been outmatched, not by courage, not by strategy, but by humans united in effort and a factory built for speed. And in Hitler's mind that was impossible. Canaris's warnings became quieter, more coded. He circulated information carefully, aware that the wrong word in the wrong ear could be fatal. Yet the truth could not be stopped. Every bomb, every destroyed factory, every exhausted pilot proved the numbers were correct. The Reich's decline was now visible, tangible, unstoppable. By 1944, the tide of destruction was undeniable. German cities lay in rubble, supply lines were shattered, and the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The warnings Canaris had delivered in March 1943 had finally come to fruition, but at a terrible cost. The Reich was crumbling, and those who had tried to save it were now under threat. And for Canaris, the danger was no longer theoretical. The Gestapo were closing in. Every report he filed, every fact he presented, made him a target. His enemies within the SS and Hitler's inner circle saw his loyalty to truth as betrayal. The man who had understood the scale of the enemy, who had tried to prepare Germany for the storm, now faced the very machinery of the state he had tried to save. The war above Germany was a storm of fire and steel. Below, in the offices of power, it was a storm of ego, fear, and denial. Canaris stood in the eye of both, holding the truth that could have changed everything. But in a system built on ideology rather than reality, truth was a dangerous burden, and the cost of carrying it was about to be paid in full. By early 1945, the Reich was a shadow of its former self. Cities lay in ruins, factories were gone, and the Luftwaffe had been crushed. The relentless tide of B-24s from WWII had transformed the war into a one-sided struggle. Every bomb dropped, every engine humming across the Atlantic was proof that Canaris had been right all along. The numbers had spoken the truth Germany refused to see. Canaris himself was trapped. The Gestapo had closed in. Uncovering his connections to the resistance, his efforts to protect those hunted by the regime, and the quiet ways he had tried to shield Germany from complete collapse. In Hitler's paranoid eyes, Canaris was no longer a loyal officer, he was a traitor. Every report he had filed, every warning he had issued, became evidence against him. On April 9, 1945, in the final weeks of a war Germany could no longer hope to win, Canaris was executed at Flossenbürg concentration camp. Stripped and humiliated, his life ended with piano wire, a brutal punishment for a man who had seen the future clearly and tried to prevent it. The regime he had served had turned on him. The man who understood the arithmetic of victory and defeat, who had warned of the unstoppable power of human effort and industry, was silenced. Meanwhile, the B-24s continued to pour from Willow Run and other American factories. By the end of the war, the numbers were staggering. Willow Run alone had produced nearly 7,000 complete Liberators, more than the entire German heavy bomber fleet. Across the United States, over 300,000 aircraft rolled off assembly lines, while Germany had managed just over 90,000. One factory, one nation, and ordinary people working together had crushed the Third Reich not on the battlefield, but in production halls and assembly lines. The tragedy of Germany was not a lack of courage or strategy, but a refusal to see reality. Hitler and his generals had clung to ideology, ego, and fantasy. They had dismissed the spies, ignored the numbers, and trusted prejudice over fact. Canaris had given them the chance to understand the scale of the threat, to prepare, to survive, but truth was treated as heresy. Their blindness sealed the fate of millions. Yet the story of Willow Run lives on. It is not only a story of bombs, factories, and war. It is a story of ordinary people achieving the extraordinary. Men and women of different races, religions, and backgrounds came together to build a force that changed history. The world's most powerful industrial weapon was not a secret missile or a supertank. It was the human spirit applied in relentless, organized effort. March 17, 1943, was the day the truth arrived in Berlin. But it was ignored, and when the consequences finally came, Germany had no defense, no plan, and no one willing to listen. The Third Reich fell, not to secret weapons or espionage, but to reality itself, the unstoppable math of production, unity, and determination. The lesson endures. Truth is often unwelcome, inconvenient, and dangerous, but it cannot be silenced forever. And when it is ignored, truth is ignored. The cost is catastrophic. The factories of Michigan proved that people, working together with focus and purpose, could change the world and history remembers.